There's no more important event in world history than the Second World War. In the Second World War, 60 million human beings were killed, and all of our lives were changed forever. I think you have to imagine that when you look back at the Second World War, most of what we know about who we are and what we think is, in one way or another, is derived from that event, from that conflict from 1939 to 1945. And when people today think for themselves about what right and wrong is, they have a store of moral judgments derived from that event. The Second World War is the point where we know what evil is, or we think we do. And evil in the Second World War is the Holocaust and the Nazis. And in that moral tale of the Second World War, we situate ourselves, all of us, all institutions, all political parties, all governments, one way or another, situate themselves in relationship to the Second World War. Because they all, in one way or another, they describe those events and put themselves as the good people. We have the ultimate evil of Hitler's Germany, and we have the good people who fought against it. Antifascism is the ideology of the present age, and you can see it in our films and novels, amongst our moral philosophers, in everyday conversation. We know what wickedness is because we've seen it. We've seen it filmed, we've seen it reenacted, we've seen it dramatized, we've heard it described. Dads all over the world have stacks of books about the Second World War, and they go through looking at the tanks and the planes, and even in that boring kind of technical understanding, they are situating themselves in relationship to a moral event. Now, Cyril Lionel James, C.L.R. James, was in America in the Second World War. He'd been invited by Leon Trotsky to come to America. And Trotsky, who was actually in Mexico but was advising the small band of revolutionaries that he was communicating with, wanted to have a friend, somebody who thought like him, who could talk to black America. And that was really what James went to America for. He went to America for himself because he was a revolutionary. He believed in a revolution to overthrow the existing order, and he'd been convinced of that. And he'd been convinced of it so much that he wasn't even satisfied with the Russian Revolution. Even that, to him, had fallen short. And Trotsky was an important person to him for that reason, because Trotsky was, as it were, the conscience and soul of the Russian Revolution. And James admired him, and so was keen to go. And he spent a very, very interesting time. It's about 15 years he spent in the United States. And he went all over the place. He traveled all through America. He traveled through, in particular, the southern states, recording what was happening. But he spent time, too, in the North American states, amongst black people in America, talking to them, finding out what was taking place. And he spent the time with the socialists in America, the revolutionary socialists, who believed, like him, that world revolution was a possibility, more than a possibility, something that had to happen. And in the middle of all of that, he did this one thing, he made this one contribution, which should make us think again about what we know, should make us think again about just how sure we are that justice lay on the side of the democracies and wickedness was restricted to the fascist regimes. Because the one thing that maybe doesn't sit with our perception of C.L.R. James today, you know, today we see his name on the side of the Dalston Library in 4-foot-high letters. And he's a kind of a grand old man. In universities, he's on the reading lists. His history of the Haitian revolt The Black Jacobins is well respected. He's an accepted figure in our modern world, but he wasn't in his own day. He was part of a very minority trend and very angry. I don't think he was personally an angry person, but very angry with what was taking place. And what particularly animated him and his fellow comrades was that they did not believe the world should go to war. They did not believe that the world should go to war to divide again the world up between Axis and Allied powers. They did not believe that people should be sacrificed, that millions of people should be sacrificed to the self-aggrandizement and enrichment of a tiny minority. And that idea, I suppose, makes sense to a lot of people if we were talking about the First World War, but it was quite strange, and is strange, to say it of the Second World War, because we feel sure, most of us, that we know that wickedness lay in one corner of the world and good in the other. Good lay in the United States and in Britain, and wickedness lay in Germany and Japan. But that wasn't James's view. This is what he said. This is a pamphlet that he wrote that was signed A Native Son, which is honour to his good friend, the novelist who wrote A Native Son. And he wrote it in the style of a fireside chat. And a fireside chat was something that Roosevelt, the American president, would give. A fireside chat, that's to say, an intimate talk to the American people, an intimate vernacular conversation. And this is his parody of Roosevelt's fireside chat. In the pamphlet, which is written as a talk, he reinvents himself. He isn't C.L.R. James, he's a native son, and he imagines he's an American, a black American, who's fought in the First World War. Tell me, Mr. President, what democracy do I defend by going to fight Hitler? Hitler is a vile criminal and should be driven off the face of the earth. But I have no democracy, and the democracy I haven't got, Hitler didn't take from me. And that's the point of his criticism. He says, I agree. It's true. Fascism is grotesque. More than that, he said, and I told you that. I'm a big fan of the I told you so school of history. And when James said, I told you so, he meant it. He meant to say that he was one of that small band of people who warned people against the terrors of fascism. He was one of those small group of people who said the Nazis are the problem and we should attack them as hard as we can. At the same time that Roosevelt and Churchill and the leaders of the democracy were their friends. In the Evening Standard newspaper, Winston Churchill would write stories about what a great stand-up guy Hitler was. This is true. I'm not making this up. And he talked about what a great guy Mussolini was. When Roosevelt's cabinet first met, they were all given a copy of a book by Giovanni Gentile about industrial leadership. Giovanni Gentile was a fascist, Italian fascist philosopher. And what Roosevelt's secretary was doing, he was saying, that's how we should run our economy in America. Top-down, fascistic, boss politics. And many people at the time said, Roosevelt, Hitler, they're kind of cut from the same cloth. Big rallies, suspension of democracy, overthrowing the judges, all these things were in Roosevelt's arsenal. Direct action to solve the crisis. Of course, we don't say that now, because now we think of Roosevelt as we think of Churchill, as the enemy of Hitler, as the enemy of the Axis powers, which of course they were in the Second World War. But what James understood was that they were cut from the same cloth in that they were elites seeking to dominate, seeking to frustrate and suborn the rights of ordinary people, people who tore up democracy, who threw it in the bin. There's a good reason why James understood this particular outlook of Churchill and of Roosevelt, and that's that he'd grown up in the colonies. Well, many people grew up in the colonies, but he grew up thinking and arguing. He grew up in Trinidad. Must have been a strange place, Trinidad, because amongst his close friends were key figures in the revolutionary movement, great men who changed the world. George Padmore, who played a key role in making the revolution in Africa after the Second World War. Stokely Carmichael, who went on to become Black Power leader. Eric Williams, who became later Prime Minister of Trinidad, who was taught in a series of seminars by C.L.R. James, talking about the question of slavery and capitalism. It was a great, rich time when people were critical and were seeing through empires, and they could see the lie that empires were, that they weren't civilizing missions, that they were brutal, exploitative, dictatorial businesses. So when the war loomed, when it begun between Britain and Germany, James didn't say, I'm on the side of the democracy against the fascists, because he knew what the democracy meant. He knew that of the 50 million people in Britain who had a vote, that there were another 360 million in the British Empire who did not. That for all the claim to represent freedom and liberty and welfare, the true British Empire that Churchill was fighting to defend was an empire of exploitation and brutality and atrocity. And he understood that by his keen conversations, communications with radicals fighting throughout the British Empire. So he was not a man predisposed to believe that Churchill represented democracy and that Hitler was the only wicked person in the game. And he knew and was coming to know better America. He knew that the regime, the Roosevelt regime, was not a liberal, generous, kind regime that stood for ordinary people. He knew that it was a dictatorship. And his friends, the men that he worked with, the women that he worked with, in the small revolutionary groups that he participated in, had an extraordinary influence in the events that took place as they unfolded in the Second World War. Because he knew, and they knew, that the lie that America was fighting for freedom would be played out in particular in the factories. They knew that what it really meant was that to fight the war, that Roosevelt would make the factories into dictatorships. And he and his friends talked to the factory workers. They talked to the people who were being driven to work 50 and 60-hour weeks in the armaments industries on the belief, on the claim that they were fighting for freedom and democracy, when their real lives were experienced as dictatorship and oppression. And he knew, and his friend explained to him, that on every shop floor, in every large factory in the United States, there was a military officer waiting to pull you up, a man in uniform, if you had stepped out of line. He knew that in Britain, that government officials would direct you where you had to work. And if you absconded from work, they would send you to prison, as hundreds, thousands of people were sent to prison for breaking the regulations on where they should be. They knew too that the supposed leaders, the people who claimed to be the representatives of the working people, had made a terrible deal, a Faustian pact with the government, the no-strike deal. The Walter Reuther negotiated no-strike deal that the United Auto Workers had struck. And under the no-strike deal, the workers gave up their freedom. And under that deal, they turned America into dictatorship. They turned it into a dictatorship where no elections really took place because everything was dominated by war, where people were starved and reduced to poverty wages so that their lives were truncated. But that was in America and in Britain. What happened in the colonies? What happened in those colonies that James understood so well? Well, he talked about it. He talked about the difference. He talked about the difference between the war news as it was relayed, about the betrayals of Pearl Harbor, about the terrible successes of the Jap army, the yellow peril that was sweeping across the Pacific. And he understood that it wasn't quite as it was told. This is him writing in 1942. After Pearl Harbor followed the catastrophes of Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. And one thing stood out in all these defeats. The native peoples took not the slightest interest in either the British defeat or Japanese victory. In Burma, many fought on the Japanese side. And he was writing in particular about India, which he spent a lot of time talking about, which he was particularly interested in because he knew what would be taking place in India, because India was going to be ripped off and bled dry by the British Empire to fight its war. And it was ripped off to this extent that in Bengal, in West Bengal, all the rice was taken. It was robbed from people and sent off to Ceylon to feed the rubber workers because the British authorities had decided that India was untrustworthy. It was rebellious. In 1942, they'd gone to war against the Indian people, driving the Indian Congress leaders underground or into prison. And they'd fought a war in the middle of the war against the Indian people. And then in their anger, there's no way to leaven that fact. They said, the Indian people are not trustworthy, take their food, send it to Ceylon for the war effort. And the local officials on the ground said, if you do this, people will starve. And Churchill and his scientific advisor said, well, there are too many Indians anyway. This is true, it's all recorded. There are too many Indians, they're greedy. They should have less children. And if they starve, well, that's Malthus. That's Thomas Malthus' justification. They did. 3.5 million died in the Bengal famine. 3.5 million. That's a substantial proportion of all the people that died. At that time, the Indian National Army, which was a pro-Japanese militia, was organized amongst the Indian diaspora. And it was led by a man called Bose, Chandra Bose. And Bose said, I can't bear to see my compatriots starve. He said, I can't bear to see it. It's too shocking. I know I'm here with the Japanese, but we have rice. Let us send you rice. We'll send you rice to stop the people starving. And the British authorities who ruled India at that time, they said, no, we will not accept this propaganda motif. We will not let these people live because for the war effort, we will stand fast against the Japanese. They sacrificed 3.5 million people to their war against Japan, a war in which Indian people had no interest whatsoever. They hadn't even been asked whether they wanted to be in the war. They were told they were in the war. Now, James understood that because he was an anti-colonialist. He understood that when we talked about democracy, the democracy in Britain, which he loved, by the way, insofar as it existed, he was a keen student of it, but he knew that it only really existed for the 50 million human beings then who lived in Britain. They had the vote. The people in the colonies didn't. So for most of the colonies, there was no difference. And that was his point. There was no difference. Now, C.L.R. James was one of very few people who stood against the official explanation of the war. One of the very few people who said, the truth is, this is not a war for democracy. It's not good versus evil. It's not democracy versus fascism. It's two imperialist, predatory powers reigned against each other. And he understood that the victory in the war that would come, the American victory that was going to come, really wouldn't come to liberate the people, but really to introduce another kind of oppression and exploitation. He loved America. That might sound funny, considering what I've just said. He loved America, the culture. He loved America, the people, the civilization. He wrote a fantastic book called American Civilization about its phenomenal popular culture, about the richness that it had to offer, about all the ideas that it had to give the world. But he understood that the politics of domination and oppression and exploitation were what held America back, what poisoned the chalice. And for that reason, he liked to be in America. He didn't want to be expelled from America, as eventually he was. He wanted to defend what was good in America, as he wanted to see what was good in the British Empire. But what he didn't want to do was to join in a fake war for a phony democracy whose endpoint would be the exploitation and oppression of colonial peoples across the world. And that was why he said, well, I think we can still find almost impossible to understand that the Second World War wasn't good versus evil, that it wasn't justice versus intolerance, that it really was the division of the world between two empires, the one degenerate German monstrous empire, the other tottering, foul British Empire, both exploiters, and that a third party coming in to take the place of the Britain and Germany, the United States, would not be the liberation of mankind. It wouldn't be democracy. It would be the continuation of that uneven and unjust world. Now, that makes him sound a lot angrier than he is, because James, like I said, loved the civilization. You know, nowadays we tend to think of all the good stuff, like their films and their novels and their Coca-Cola, as wicked. We tend to think of it as very bad, and that's kind of what's wrong with America today. That wasn't his view. He loved the films. He wrote eloquently about Melville, about Charlie Chaplin. He wrote about Dirk Bogarde, and he wrote about everybody because he loved the films. He loved the civilization, and he wanted to give American civilization its best chance. And he knew that really to do that meant to challenge the view that America should dominate the world, that Britain should dominate the world. And instead, he wanted to let the people set themselves free. Just want to kind of end here. He says this, he says about, in 1943, he said, to save Europe for capitalism, American imperialism must wring every drop out of its glory as the liberator of the continent from German fascism. But, he says, it is bitterly hostile to the underground movements of both France, Germany, and Italy, the basis of a future proletarian unity. Today, he said, American capital has had to take upon itself the defense of European capital and the defense of European interests in Africa and the Far East against their incorporation by Germany and the new contender Japan. American imperialism therefore becomes the chief bulwark of the capitalist system as a whole. And that was the thing that he didn't want and didn't want to support. That was the reason he didn't sign up to Roosevelt's campaign to democratize the world with its 4 freedoms, because he believed in the true freedom, the freedom of the colonial people to determine their own future. And why he gave his support to George Padmore when he set out the campaign to free Africa from its colonial masters. and why he sympathized and supported the working people who he lauded and praised, like John Lewis, the miners' leader, who, as Truman remembered, organized not one but 2 strikes in the back of the American soldier, as Truman saw it, betrayed the American war effort, because James was really an optimist and a happy man. And he was a happy man because he understood that the real America was not the America of domination and colonialism and imperialism, but it was the America of the working people, the America of the people who were prepared to go on strike, who were prepared to protest. He identified with the America that rose up against racial domination and rioted in Harlem and Detroit. And he said, don't talk to me about your freedom. What about our freedom here? What about the freedom for the black man in America? What about the freedom for the working man in America? That's the true freedom, not the freedom of overlords and kings and princes, not the freedom of generals and bosses, but the freedom of ordinary people, the people that made the American culture and civilization that he adored. I would really love to hear what you've got to say, and questions or points, and I'd like to take a few of those just from you, the audience.
I just wondered what C.L.R. James' connection was with people like Pete Seeger and Paul Robeson, and if they had any good debates.
James is, a shining example of, the fact there are so few people opposing the Second World War, and it really stands out. Why were there so few, and who were the others? What was particular about James?
Well, one thing that struck me in your discussion of C.L.R. James was his distinction between American politics and American culture. I mean, it's quite common to trash Western culture quite widely, and that seems to be a problem today. And I was sort of wondering, there's sort of switch that's happened. C.L.R. James was very clear about his politics and his culture, and today we've got a lot of people criticising America and the West culturally, but saying nothing about politics.
Niall started with a question about why were there so few who opposed the Second World War. I think I must have said that, but in a sense it's not true. One of the great things about James was that he had this deep democratic sense of the people. He would never have dared to have imposed upon the world a view that had no real basis. Many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, resisted what was done to them in the name of the war. There was a massive revolt against the war, which, though it was never really quite gelled into a singular political proposition, as James would have wished it, the ordinary people, working people, industrial workforce in the United States were, after their initial confusion and anxiety about aiding fascism, had made a terrible deal, the no-strike clause. And within about a year, the no-strike clause was challenged all across the United States, and there are hundreds of thousands of strikes taking place and hundreds of thousands of people going on strike in resistance and in opposition to the military leaders who were telling them that they must sacrifice everything to the victory. The United Auto Workers in particular, and the miners and the railway workers struck and organised massive, bitter, aggressive strikes in the face of the most extraordinary repression. They used CS gas, they used tear gas against the munitions workers in Milwaukee. When John Lewis organised the strike, he organised 2 big strikes in the middle of the Second World War, the American government reacted hysterically. As I say, they sent troops in to fight munitions workers. They occupied the mines. The mines were reopened under armed guards with the American flag flying over them. The employers were pushed to one side. They were told, the miners, that they were working for the government, that they had been nationalised. It's a little-known fact. And John Lewis turned around and said, well, if we have no contract of labour, the last thing we would do, of course, is to trespass upon these mines that now belong to the government. So we'll stay out. And Roosevelt was kind of pulling his hair out and having a histrionic fit about this whole regime, and eventually just gave in. And he gave them the pay rise that they were demanding. And John Lewis, who was a taciturn man, who himself would never have said that he was against the Second World War. It wasn't his thinking at all. But he was against the cruelty that was imposed and the exploitation that was imposed upon his workers, because he was a man of his members. He believed in them. And when they fought against the conditions that they were made to work under, he stood by them. And that's why in his book, American Civilization, which was never published, I think, in his lifetime, a manuscript that was not put out, in the middle of it, he says, there is a true American hero. And he writes, it's strange reading it because it seems, in a way, kind of vulgar to talk about American heroes and great American individuals. And the man he alights on is the taciturn, aggressive, unloved, apart from by his own miners, John Lewis, a true American hero, a Lincoln of his day. And it's quite an extraordinary statement, and he's making the statement because he understood that the war was bent and distorted and twisted the whole of American society, as it distorted and twisted the world. That the war effort, the creation of not means of consumption but means of extermination, was a terrible thing, and that it was consuming people. John Lewis said of the 100,000 injuries that had been taken place in the mines, that's a lot of human meat to grind up, said the bitter and angry John Lewis. And James understood what he was saying, because James listened to the American workers when they resisted what was being done in their name. So he really wasn't on his own. It was true too of the Indian people who rose up, an extraordinary revolt against the British Empire, as, by the way, also the Burmese, having supported the Japanese when they invaded, later turned around and fought against the Japanese occupiers. People all over the world were fighting against the war, were fighting against the warmongers to make themselves free. So when James gave voice to their ideas, it wasn't just something that popped into his head. He was trying to give a voice to a real movement that was taking place. And that was why I think his words, when we read them, are so electric. He did know Robeson. He didn't know Pete Seeger. Both Robeson and Seeger were supporters of the American Communist Party, and James wasn't. In fact, by the time that he was beginning to take a stance against oppression and exploitation, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and in America and in Britain had become a rather tamer and polite, maybe polite's the wrong word, but loyal opposition. It was the Communist Party in Great Britain that organised the joint production committees and the speed up. It was democracy versus fascism. That wasn't James's view. James situated himself, self-consciously, I think, in a different current in American society. Amongst the musicians, let's say, as a case in point, the folk musicians, by and large, being on the left, quite often anyway, were Communist Party supporters and believers in the New Deal. I think James was closer, in a way, to the bebop jazz, the people like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, who were largely unmoved by the war. And there's a very good biography of Charlie Parker in the jazz age, the bebop jazz age. The biographer makes the point that they were more than indifferent. They were resentful of the whole thing. They thought it was a lot of evil old men conspiring against the people, insofar as they thought of the people. They really were unmoved by the whole thing. And James and also Grace Lee and Raya Dunayevskaya, who were part of quite a small left-wing group, they loved America of the time. They were part of what was called the Harlem Renaissance, of the burgeoning of black culture in New York and in Detroit and in Chicago. They believed in what was taking place, which was that for the first time, many black Americans were moving out of the South, where they lived miserable lives as peasants and sharecroppers, into the North, where they were living a new life as industrial workers. And they were wild and rebellious people, and ambitious and remarkable people, as described many different ways. But people who, in their attitude to the war, were neither for nor against in many ways. Some believed in the Double V campaign, 2 victories against Jim Crow and against Japan. That was the Communist Party position. But he didn't. He said, no, we should oppose the war. We should situate ourselves in this new burgeoning movement of human beings, of living people who were making their own histories in a way that wasn't understood by the official culture. And I think that kind of goes some way to talking about American civilization, and it's a fabulous book. It's been published since he died. He does this really interesting thing for somebody who put himself so willfully in opposition to the official culture, is that it's a hymn of praise to the United States. It really is. He talks about the culture, the music. He talks about the popular culture he's particularly impressed by, in a way that many people were. You know, it was kind of a new thing that working people were educated, were literate, would go to the movies, would read newspapers. That was only kind of 30, 40 years old, and it was coming into its own in a way, you know, that so amazed Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, who'd come from Germany, and they said, oh, this is weird, you know, we don't like this jazz music, it's very kind of devilish, and, you know, why don't they listen to Schoenberg? And it's all a bit automated and unreal. But of course, James wasn't like them. You know, he wasn't that kind of waspish European intellectual, even though he was a Marxist like they were. But what he did understand was things were always had these two sides. And that was, I think, the great thing about his relationship to America. He can see the good and the bad. You know, and the bad, roughly, is the policy. You know, he's very critical of the policy. He's critical of the National Association of Manufacturers. Much of the book is taken up with a critique of industrial policy and the way that workers were alienated at work. But in the middle of it all, he's also talking about their civilization. And he understands that it's not civilization in the American sense. It's not an elite European bookish, hidden away in a high tower thing, but is mass civilization. And he's thrilled by, unlike Adorno, who was snooty about it, he's kind of thrilled by it. In a way, you kind of think, well, maybe you're getting carried away, but I understand, I think, or I feel that when you read it, you couldn't avoid understanding just the sheer excitement of what he's talking about, the sense in which, for the first time, millions of ordinary people were participating in ideas and reading and arguing about what was right and what was wrong. And even if he argued with them, you know. He loved them, and he loved the people that he disagreed with quite as much as he loved the people that he agreed with, because it was the debate. He loved the debate. He loved the talk. He could be sardonic and caustic about people who've done things wrong. But when you read the writing, it's fabulous. He's never dismissive and aggressive and rude. He's always, I wonder if there's something in that, you know. And just at the point when we're thinking, you know, that Coca-Cola imperialism is the worst thing in the world, he says some harsh things about the American forces coming to Europe. But he says excited things about what it means that we have for the first time, and I think it's real and meant, a democratic civilization emerging against the wishes of its masters, but emerging nonetheless out of the acculturation of the ordinary people.
What was his connection with Trotsky?
James, what you've described is almost like heresy to us these days, because we've been so imbued in the kind of the propaganda campaign that tells the other version. And as you mentioned in your introduction, even C.L.R. James himself has been sanitized. so we don't really know what he stood for anymore. But what are your thoughts? Why has this propaganda campaign been so successful?
Where would you say James stood when asked, what do we actually do about Hitler? Because there's a sort of a live, debate within the American left. As you said, the Communist Party broadly supported the war effort after 1941. But in James's circle, there was a sort of variety of opinions from people saying we should back resistance movements and the Soviet Union, but not the Western powers. There were people calling for the trade unions to control conscription and direct the war effort in the favour of working people. Lots of different positions in between, including what was called revolutionary defeatism at the time, was doing the rounds. So where did James stand on that specific thing? So he's against the war as a whole, but then people say, yes, comrade, what about the war effort itself? What do we do about it? Because Hitler, he was told, was, kind of unique. And the idea of the, yes, there's similarities, but at the end of the day, comrade, people will be saying to James, this lot are worse.
I was just wondering, my question is actually kind of the opposite to women's. I was going to say, it's become almost expected to question Churchill in some ways now. Even the BBC did at his funeral, and, those days wouldn't have really been able to dream of doing that. So given that, how revolutionary do you think James would be asking these questions now?
Oh, just on the factual thing about him and Trotsky, he was a Trotskyist, which means to say that he was part of a kind of a breakaway group. The communists were the left wing of the socialists, and then the Trotskyists said, well, you're not left wing enough, as it were. And they argued, I suppose, particularly about the Soviet Union. I think it's important to know that there were quite a small group of people, maybe 10,000 or so at the most, whereas you would have counted the members of the Communist Party, the communist parties across the world in their millions, and you would have counted the members of the socialist parties in their tens of millions at the point when the war broke out. And they were all influential. He had a personal relationship with Trotsky himself. Trotsky had asked him to come to America. He'd asked him. Trotsky was living in a peculiar life because he'd been expelled for being too left-wing from Russia. I mean, how left-wing do you have to be? But he'd been, he was too much in favour of the people, and they'd sent him away. And it killed lots of his allies and friends. And eventually they killed him, not long after, in fact. He'd been asked to go, he asked C.L.R. James to come to America. Trotsky was interested in James because he knew how important he was. He knew that James's relationship with the anti-colonial movement meant that he would have more authority and more ability to talk to people that he knew were important. At that time, you have to understand that in the United States, where questions of Trotsky and Stalin were vague, to say the least, many black Americans who had a very, very, very raw deal in the United States of the 1920s and 30s were allying themselves to the Communist Party, and they recruited heavily. And Trotsky knew that, and he wanted to make sure that if the communists led them the wrong way, that he would at least have some influence. And James, in Trotsky's eyes, was an interlocutor who would be able to talk to black Americans. That's why James has this kind of roving brief, going all around the South, talking to people, making friends, talking to the writers. He made great friends with Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, who were important characters. So it was important for him. And you might think that this was a trivial or a pointless exercise, like a recruiting campaign, but it wasn't, because as both Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison explained, the communists at the crucial moment, having recruited as many black Americans as they had in the campaigns that they undertook, at the crucial moment told them to shut up. And it's in Ellison's fabulous book, The Invisible Man, where he talks about, he fictionalizes the Communist Party as the Brotherhood. And he, in the novel, what the writer does is that he makes the communists manipulate black Americans for political gain and turn their anger on and off as it suited the ambitions of the Communist Party. It's quite a harsh novel, and James understood it. You know, James understood what he was saying, because it was a shocking thing that so many people had been so excited about the prospects of change that they'd been led to by the American Communist Party, and were so angry that at the key moment that they'd been told they must shut up and put their shoulder to the wheel for the war effort and not raise questions of race discrimination and oppression in America. It was important because those questions blew up big time. You know, when millions of black Americans were moving from the South to the North, making their homes in Detroit, in California, in New York, they clashed with white working class people, with the authorities, in some shocking riots where it was very important that somebody was there to say that this is the fruit of this awful war, that people are pitched against each other in this stupid and moronic way. And James was stood out for somebody who would say that this was the lie of the freedom-loving democracies, was that they would take up arms to suppress the black rioters in Harlem, that they would take up arms against their own citizens and make war against them. So it was very important that he did that work. And of course it's right that James taking on this big picture of this superficially rock-solid consensus for the war, he wasn't just taking on the Communist Party, he was taking upon all the official parties, and probably the socialist parties were more important, except for this one fact, was that the Communist parties had stood out at the beginning of the war and resisted what was taking place for peculiar reasons, and so they had authority. So that the most exciting and militant and forward-looking people tended to be around the Communist Party. So that when the Communist Party told them, no, we're not against capitalism and exploitation, we're for the freedom-loving democracies against the fascist menace, then a lot of people took their most ambitious and effective sentiment and put them instead at the behest of warmongers. I think the last thing is just how extraordinary is it, and I think this is a complicated question for this reason, is that officially anti-fascism is the ideology of the world today, but it's so thin. You know, it really is so thin that it's constantly being contradicted. And the reason it's so thin is there were some amazing lies told, some shocking lies told, like that the Japanese had it coming, that the A-bomb was too good for them, that we fought for democracy in the Far East, that the Indians were all very happy to fight for the British war effort. And there were such extraordinary lies that people have been saying ever since, no, hang on, it wasn't really like that. And there are books and books and books and books written about the lies that are told that say, why was there concentration camps built in California to house Japanese? If this was democracy, why were the concentration camps? Why were 3.5 million Indians starved to death? And so I think the lies break through, and the sense in which we believe in the democracy of the freedom-loving peoples is very, very, very compromised today, and is waiting to be broken apart.
Thank you, James, for the lecture. It was definitely thought-provoking and something different from what I've heard my whole life. You know, growing up in America, going to American schools, and having American history classes. So just hearing these views from C.L.R. James, what do you think going forward is the best thing that I can take away from it and everyone else here can take away from it?
Just following on from that, actually,
I thought that James talks a lot about how the threat to his democracy is from within his own country, and how much you thought that that would maybe relate or be resonant in today's kind of state of conflict in the US.
The real story is not about history. That's my interest, and I've talked too much about that. But I think the real lesson that James brings is don't believe the official view and doubt, but also doubt the radical view too. You know, the one that seems most obvious is the one that you must question. And that was what was quite strange about his inquiring mind, was that it would have been easy to be left-wing and communist and pro-war, but for some reason, there's something in him just wouldn't and would keep asking the question. I think the other thing that we should take from him is just how much he loved his fellow men and women, which sounds a weirdly Christian point, but he really adored the life of the ordinary people, the life of the intellectuals, and he lived in it. But he was always talking and arguing with everybody because he was interested, because he knew that it was no good being a clever clogs on your own. He knew that ideas mean nothing unless you talk to people and share those ideas and keep the conversation going, so that we continue to cherish what I think he really cherished, which was the life of the ordinary people, the democracy. There isn't a formula or a ballot box or something like that, but the real movements of human beings to change their lives, to make their lives better, and even what seemed quite obvious and maybe even boring ambitions, to read, to go to the theatre, to have an argument, things that he identified with so closely, never ever dismissing any corner of human life. And I think that is James's lesson for us today.